Bienvenidos, Iowa City, to today's program on Latinas and Latinos in the Midwest. My name is Teresa Delgadillo. I'm a professor at The Ohio State University and director of the Latina and Latino Studies program there. For the past 2 years, I've had the pleasure and honor of working with an amazing group of scholars from across the Midwest who are examining the cultural expressions and public cultures through which Latinas and Latinos make home in the region. Our project is titled Building Sustainable Worlds, Latinx Placemaking in the Midwest. And it's funded by the Humanities Without Walls Consortium, which is based at the Illinois Program for Research in the Humanities and funded by the John W. Mellon Foundation. We use the term Latinx versus the more common Latina and Latino to signal gender and sexuality inclusiveness. And we focus on placemaking, or how Latinx people construct a home or a sense of belonging in the Midwest. We're gathered here in Iowa City this week for a collaborative workshop to prepare our research for publication. And we'd like to thank the University of Iowa, and especially Teresa Mangum, director of the Obermann Center and the Obermann Center for Advanced Study, as well as our colleague, Claire Fox, for hosting us this week. We've thoroughly enjoyed our visit to Iowa City, and we've taken advantage of this time to learn more about Latinas and Latinos in Iowa. We're indebted to an earlier project, 2013 to 2015, that began here at the University of Iowa and led to the publication in 2017 of the Latino Midwest Reader. In our current collaboration, which stretches from 2017 to 2019, we're also planning to publish a volume. And in this project, we're examining print cultures and literature, recreational and leisure activities, cultural arts centers, community centers, performances, churches, and workplaces in both cities and small towns throughout the Midwest. We're finding that Latinx placemaking efforts in the Midwest offer us visions of how to build cultural, social, and physical environments that can sustain individuals, communities, and the planet. We're looking not only at the present moment, but also at longer-term practices of placemaking that have contributed to the creation of Latinx neighborhoods and centers in the region, which are often translocal, transregional, and transnationally interconnected with other Latinx and Latin American sites. So we're developing a picture of placemaking that emerges from a set of networks that stretch in multiple directions. In today's program, you'll learn more about the many research projects included in this collaborative from the researchers themselves, organized into 3 panels. And now I'd like to turn this over to my colleague Claire Fox, who will introduce the first panel.
Thank you very much, Teresa. Thank you. Well, thank you for joining us in this conversation about Latinx placemaking in the Midwest. I'm pleased to welcome 2 of my collaborators on this project. Delia Fernandez from Michigan State University. Welcome, Delia.
Thank you, Claire.
And Laura Fernandez from the Ohio State University. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you, Claire. Love to be here.
I've enjoyed visiting with you and sharing ideas with you so much over this past week, and I've learned a lot from your projects. There are many connecting threads that link our respective research on Latinx communities in the Midwest, and I'd love to hear more about your respective research projects. Delia, you're working on the Latinx community in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Yes.
Which is a unique case study because not only is it your research site, but it's also your home. Would you please say a little bit more about your work?
Yes. So I first came to this project as a graduate student. I am Mexican and Puerto Rican, and I'm from Grand Rapids. And I was very interested in learning about Latinos, both Mexican and Puerto Rican, who spent time together in these earlier decades before the 1970s. And I didn't find much at the library. And so this was a great project for a budding graduate student and researcher to take on. So I started looking at different archives to uncover the placemaking past of Puerto Ricans in Grand Rapids.
When you set out to write a history of a community that does not have a ready-made archive or museum dedicated to it, what are some of the strategies you use to reconstruct that history? Where did you turn?
That's a great question. So I ended up looking at a lot of traditional sources that historians look at, but using them against the grain. So that means to look at a source and to try to figure out what it is not saying, or to use it for a purpose that it was not necessarily created for. So the best way to describe this is to talk about jail records. I use these for a period between the 1940s and the 1960s, and these records were taken at the time of the arrest, and they included a lot of demographic information, so name, age, birth date, place of birth, whether or not somebody could read or not, or in English or in Spanish, and what their position was at the time, what their job was. And of course, these were taken so that they could have an accurate log of arrests. But for me as a researcher, I was able to look at a host of these records of Latino men in particular to get a demographic picture of what the community looked like at that time.
And what did you find after conducting this kind of archival research against the grain? Were there any surprises, any significant findings that you didn't expect?
Yes, so as I mentioned, I'm from Grand Rapids. My grandparents, my Mexican and Puerto Rican grandparents both came to the area in the 1950s. And to my surprise, someone had done an oral history with my grandmother well before I had came to this project, and I discovered it at the same time that she was passing away. And so this was a wonderful experience for me because I was able to hear about her life story and what it was like for her and her family in Grand Rapids at a time where she could no longer answer those questions. And I was also able to hear her voice at a time that really wasn't possible. And so it just showed how important it was to me that everyday people have their histories recorded and documented, because those are essentially who makes this history.
Well, that is a powerful point to be making at an archival project that intersects with your own family history.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Laura, I'd like to hear more about your research too, which took you into many small communities and medium-sized towns in the state of Ohio. What were you working on?
So our project is a little bit different. It was a team project, myself and Teresa, who was just on, as well as two other graduate students, Leila Vieira and Marie Lerma, as well as two undergraduates, Sophie de la Cruz and Genevieve Arce. And we just went all over Ohio looking for Latino festivals, Hispanic festivals, whatever kind of ethnic festival we could find. We ended up going to 12 different festivals in 6 different cities, hitting up all the major cities such as Dayton, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Columbus, where we're based at OSU, and even small rural towns like Springfield and Youngstown. And a lot of it was just going to these festivals, participating, eating the food, of course, and talking to the people who were there, whether they're Latino or not, just asking how they felt being in this kind of festival space, and if they were Latino, how they felt being a minority group within a larger white population. We wanted to get to that sense of home. Could they find a home here or there in Ohio? And the overwhelming answer was yes, of course. But there is a caveat to that. There's a home, but there's no real Latino community because they're so scattered. So they come to these festivals as a way of building that community with people like themselves.
I'm intrigued by this idea that the festival could be conceived of as a home. This project has been dedicated to the concept of placemaking. How can a festival that lasts one day or a weekend or several days be considered to be an aspect of Latinx placemaking in the Midwest?
So for us who are attending, yeah, it's a day or two or maybe a weekend. But for the organizers who are creating these events, this is a year-long thing. They are planning the next festival the day after the festival ends. And for the people attending the festivals, they know what's coming. They know what's on the calendar. These festivals are really well advertised in the newspapers, the radio, just everywhere. So people know to look forward to these events. They have a really long history. The one in Columbus, the Festival Latino, has been going for about 20 years. So people know it's there. The organizers are doing their hardest to get the message out there, to work with the city. So it's a couple days for the people, but it's a whole community behind it as well.
That's really interesting. Now, having attended, you said 6 festivals in a pretty concentrated period of time, does one in particular stand out as more memorable or special in some way?
So for me, that would be Columbus's Festival Latino. It was definitely the largest festival. Apparently there was over 200,000 people just this past year alone. And it's the most pan-Latino festival.
What does pan-Latino mean?
So some of the festivals we went to, such as in Cleveland, you have the Puerto Rican Heritage Parade and the Puerto Rican Festival. And so that's pretty limited to a Puerto Rican audience. Sure, we went and they welcomed us, but it's still, I myself am Colombian American, so really, we're a really small group of Latinos. So when I go to the Festival Latino, which is much more broader in range, it's all the nationalities that fall under this umbrella term of Latino. I went there and I was wearing my Colombian soccer team national jersey, and some of the vendors who were Colombian, they would call out to me, "Oh, paisana," which means countrywoman. So it was a great moment of myself finding a community, reminding myself that just because I'm a researcher doesn't mean the research doesn't also include me.
Excellent. You know, there are aspects of both of your projects that have been very helpful for me in thinking through my own work in connection with this group. I've been working in an even smaller community than either of your case studies. My research has taken me to a community of 4,300 people in north central Iowa called Hampton. I wasn't even aware personally that this town existed, except that once over spring break I became interested in retracing the steps of a famous Chicano author who spent some of his life as a migrant worker during his youth in the state of Iowa, and the name of Hampton comes up in his biography. When I visited this town, I learned that Tomás Rivera, the author that interested me, is still remembered in Hampton, and furthermore, the town has a significant and growing Latinx population. So, like you, Delia, I became interested in how do you tell the history or collective memory of that Latinx community when there isn't really a substantial ready-made print archive to lead the way. And Tomás Rivera's stories were really helpful in that regard. I learned that elementary school children in the local library still preserve a memory of Rivera's presence in this town. Another thing that links my project to yours, Laura, is that the community center that serves Latinx people in Hampton organizes an annual festival. And it took place this past June, so I was lucky to be able to attend with my family. And what I saw was a very significant showing of Latinx Hamptonians, but also of Latinx peoples from other surrounding communities. And there was a pretty mixed group in attendance at the festival. There were a lot of Latinx people, but also a lot of non-Latinx people there too. And one of the most surprising moments for me was when some surprise guests showed up at this festival. A pretty famous rock band from Mexico called Los Super Caracoles from the state of Veracruz came. It's a large group, and they took the stage and played one of their hit songs. So in this small, out-of-the-way place, I became aware of how it was connected to these larger circuits of entertainment, largely through the connections of the people that had settled in Hampton.
Wow.
I really want to thank you for this conversation, and I look forward to future conversations with you about our project.
Definitely.
Yes.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to introduce my colleague in history from Northwestern University, also a co-principal investigator on this project, Geraldo Cadava. Hi, Jerry.
Hi. Thank you, Claire.
Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, thank you again for joining us. My name is Geraldo Cadava. I teach in the History Department and the Latino Studies program at Northwestern University. For our Humanities Without Walls grant on, or our project on Latinos and Latinx in the Midwest, I'm writing about the Chicago Latino Film Festival, and I'm looking forward to telling you a little bit more about that project as our conversation unfolds. First, I wanted to introduce you to the colleagues who've joined me here. This is my colleague at Northwestern, Ramon Rivera Cervera. To my right is Larry LaFontaine Stokes from the University of Michigan, and Teresa Delgadillo from the Ohio State University. I think compared with our colleagues who just spoke, Laura and Claire and Delia, I think whereas they were working on very kind of site-specific projects, our projects are more about the dissemination of Latinidad from the Midwest elsewhere. So I think that's what we're going to be talking about over the next few minutes. And Teresa, you had the chance to introduce our project broadly a few minutes ago, but now I'd like to hear a little bit more about your particular project.
So the chapter I'm writing for this particular our collaboration is on Latino literature about the Midwest. And by that, I mean there's a great wealth of literature produced by Latinos in the Midwest and by Latinas in the Midwest. And so in this chapter, I'm looking at a smaller set of that literature that takes the Midwest as its setting and that also offers us a examination and a critique of the destruction of the environment in that region. Not often from the most likely source. That is, this literature doesn't present as literature about nature or about the environment. It's literature about Latinas and Latinos making place, but making place through their work lives and through their lives in ways that reveal their engagement with the kinds of damaging environments that do exist in the region, and their sense of otherness as well, their sense of otherness in the region, and their visions for how that might change, or what are the possibilities for change. And so I look at quite a few authors who are doing that kind of an exploration in the literature.
That's terrific. And Teresa, one of the threads that kind of runs through the work that you do and connects it with the work that Ramon does are these themes of movement and migration and work. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, Ramon, if you could talk to us about how those themes kind of work in your project, and maybe Teresa can chime in about that too.
Sure, absolutely. Very much like Teresa, I've been pursuing the work of artists who themselves document practices of placemaking, homemaking in the Midwest. Mm-hmm. The artists that I'm working with, instead of working in literature, work in dance. Mm-hmm. So I'm working with Anita Gonzalez, who's a professor of dance at the University of Michigan, theater and dance, and is a practitioner with a long tradition of research into Afro-Mexican performance genres like son jarocho. And Joel Valentin Martinez, who's also a professor of dance at Northwestern University, one of our colleagues, who also has a long extended tradition of exploring son jarocho, the same Afro-Mexican genre. And the two of them have undertaken this project where they're researching the history of African American and Mexican migration to the Midwest, especially around the Lake Michigan region. So it's really interesting to see these two artists whose aesthetic and research interests already combine the intersection between African American and Latino traditions of art making, specifically through the platform of choreography, and see them use that work of choreography with its focus on movement to study this northward migration towards the Great Lakes region, and then the kind of labor and circulation around Lake Michigan as a space. What's really curious to me is that they land their research on practices of labor and leisure. So in doing this really microscopic research onto how movements, repetitive movements of agricultural and industrial labor, but also choreographies of social dance at clubs or entertainment centers that became platforms for social exchange across these communities, become really articulate sites for thinking about how groups, ethnic and racial groups, came together in the Midwest and made home together in that context.
Yeah.
And Teresa, in your first answer, the emphasis was on and the environment and sustainability. Did you have anything you wanted to add to the themes of?
Well, it connects to this idea that, I'm going to that Ramon has raised about mobility and home and placemaking, because I think in the authors that I'm looking at, they really present, let's say, three different visions of migration and significance of migration in building home and placemaking. In Fred Arroyo's work in Western Avenue and other fictions, we have revolves around a set of characters who are Puerto Rican migrant laborers who first come here to work in the fields and then work in light assemblies, smaller factories, and then over the years disperse. And that collection of stories focuses on the way that a network of individuals, a set of social relationships, constitutes home and helps to create a place of belonging in the region. In Sandra Cisneros' work in Caramelo, which I also discuss in this chapter, is we see a family, Chicago-based family, that travels every summer back to Mexico. That's a part of their annual life. The family all together goes back to Mexico. And so this novel is very much a novel about a transnational family, a family that lives in both Mexico and the United States and carries back and forth with them cultural influences from both places as a way of making home. And then in Hugo Martinez Ceros' stories, which are set in Chicago, South Chicago, The Last Laugh and other stories, we have stories that revolve around a working class steelworker family, early to mid 20th century Chicago, that where they don't have the mobility to be able to travel back and forth to Mexico regularly, and they don't have the mobility through the region, but they, within Chicago, the industrial area and the edges of Chicago, they have some mobility, and at those edges of Chicago, they participate in recreating environmentally sustainable farming practices that they bring with them, the father brings with him from Mexico, right? The Mesoamerican practice of making milpa. And so we see in that array, right, these very different approaches to making home, all of which involve migration and mobility in very different ways.
Yeah, yeah. And I think Larry and I, too, in our own way, are bringing together themes of work and migration and home, the construction of home in the Midwest, but also in relation to other places, and also leisure. I mentioned that I'm writing an essay about the Chicago Latino Film Festival, and I think it does many of these same things. This was a festival that was started in the mid-1980s and has grown consistently over the past 30-some years into a film festival, one of the largest Latino film festivals in the country, if not the hemisphere, that projects hundreds of films each year from throughout Latin America and Spain and Portugal, and now draws more than 10,000 viewers every year to Chicago to come and see the films. And I'm interested in the kind of projection of hemispheric, if not global, version of Latino identity, but even beyond the kind of content of the films themselves and the kinds of Latino identity that they project. I'm interested in the spectacle of the festival as well, and the kind of whole scene that makes up the festival, the galas and the attendees and the board of directors and who makes up the whole festival. And Larry, you too are working on an artist that projects Latino and Latinx identity from the Midwest, but really throughout the United States and into the Caribbean. So can you tell us a little bit about Fausto Fernos?
Sure. So I am writing a chapter on Fausto Fernos, who is a Puerto Rican drag artist, an alternative media content producer, a performance artist. He was born and raised in San Juan. He moved to Austin, Texas, where he went to school. Then he moved to Chicago to pursue graduate studies at the School of the Art Institute. And he has been in Chicago for over 20 years. But it's almost that triangular configuration of growing up in Puerto Rico, moving to Texas, living in Chicago means that he has multiple references, and at each site he has done different work. And because he is creating work for the internet, podcast, The Feast of Fun, which is now in its 14th year, over 2,600 shows, YouTube series, most notably or best known, Cooking with Drag Queens, in which I have appeared, now over 30 episodes. What that means is that even though the content is being created in Chicago and frequently features artists who live in Chicago, it is literally being transmitted at a global level, and people watch it around the country and around the world. And for Fausto, being Puerto Rican is really at the heart of his identity, being bilingual and being queer. So of course, drag is a type of performance that frequently integrates comedy. So Fausto negotiates the challenges, difficulties, and paradoxes of being a colonial subject, of being queer, of being Latino, of being light-skinned, of being white and middle class, an artist who can barely live off his art, because as we all know, most artists are not able to sustain their careers through their art making. So he negotiates all these things through multiple platforms, including podcasting and video production. And extraordinarily, very few people have written about him at the academic level. So in my paper, I'm sort of trying to make sense of over 20 years of career, focusing specifically on his drag production and trying to understand what does it mean to be a queer Puerto Rican drag performer in Chicago, creating these transnational circuits through media.
Yeah, these are all such fantastic projects, and I'm really looking forward to seeing them in print in our book.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you so much.
Jerry.
I think this is a really good opportunity to introduce 3 more wonderful projects that are part of this series. So thank you so much, you guys.
Thank you, Ramon.
I want to invite 3 more colleagues to join me here. Ariana Ruiz is a professor here at the University of Iowa. Emiliano Aguilar, who's a doctoral student in history at Northwestern University, and Sergio Gonzalez, who's an assistant professor at Marquette University. And one of the things that we've been doing, if you have just joined us here at PATV, is that we have been talking about a collaborative research project across university professors and researchers in the greater Midwest, specifically interested in pursuing the ways in which Latino communities make home, make place here in the Midwest. And we've been examining a wide range of platforms and opportunities and cultural practices that open up the possibility of making these communities, these geographies, these environments our home. And one of the key things has been looking at practices of cultural practice, activism, art making. And the 3 projects that we have here today really talk quite engagingly about additional techniques in Indiana, in Wisconsin, and in Chicago. So I want to start with Emiliano. Emiliano, your project has to do with how Latinos in the mid-20th century gain access to labor practices, specifically in the state of Indiana. Would you tell us a little bit about your project?
Absolutely. So my project looks at my hometown in Northwest Indiana, East Chicago, and how a Saul Alinsky group of working class citizens called the Concerned Latins Organization sought to gain employment within the East Chicago Fire Department so this really shows this tension between affirmative action programs at the local level, despite federal legislation really supposed to open the doors for this sort of employment. They still come up against barriers such as exorbitant fees and the lack of opportunities that they saw fit for their community as these changing demographics occur. Latino population becomes a larger population in Chicago between the 1960s and 1970s, and really what the Concerned Latins organization tries to do is seek better opportunities not only in employment but education and housing as well.
Emiliano, your project looks at a similar kind of strategy a little bit later in the 20th century, starting in the 1980s, but really centering the critical role of the church, especially in the sanctuary movement. Would you tell us a little bit about that project?
Absolutely. You know, I think in 2018, as immigration has risen as one of the most prominent political questions of our time, the word that has really come out is this term sanctuary. We see it in the words of sanctuary state or sanctuary city or even sanctuary restaurant. And what my project seeks to do is to understand this concept of sanctuary in a larger historical narrative. And so I really look at the practice of sanctuary as political activism for Central American refugees and asylees here in the Midwest in the 1980s. Sanctuary is a practice that goes back to Jewish and Christian traditions and has manifestations in the medieval period, in the 19th century with the Underground Railroad, and even the 1960s with anti-Vietnam War protesters. But in the 1980s, there coalesced a movement that began along the border region in places like Arizona and California and eventually made its way to here to the Midwest, a solidarity movement with Central Americans arriving in the United States. In the second half of the 20th century, civil wars rocked the Central American countries of El Salvador and Guatemala. 2 million people made their way northward in search of refugee asylum. They arrived here in the United States, 1 million of those people, and applied for official refugee status, but they soon found that their applications were being summarily dismissed. Fewer than 3% of those applications were actually being accepted. And so religious congregations, beginning in the border region, but eventually across the United States, began to ask themselves, what is our obligation as religious communities to step forward and to assist these people, to stand with them as they seek a safe space here in the United States? And so what I look at here in the Midwest is how that sanctuary movement, the opening of religious spaces as places of sanctuary for Central Americans, manifested in Chicago first, but then in places like Milwaukee and Madison, Wisconsin.
This is really wonderful work, and what I like about these two projects is the ways in which they use history to even earlier history's precedent historical practice to the particular actions of placemaking that you're pursuing. And Ariana, you're doing a similar kind of move with these alternative printing cultures that draw on early aesthetic techniques of zine making, right? Would you tell us a little bit more about the zine culture in Chicago and what zines are first?
Sure, thank you, Ramon. And I will begin with a very short description of what a zine is. And so that's a self-published, self-made magazine. Aesthetically, it has a very DIY, so do-it-yourself, cut and paste look to it. They're printed in small runs, and a part of that is because they are largely photocopied, so it also has that Xerox feel to it. I will say that zine makers have taken on new media forms in order to showcase their zines, but the zines that I'm specifically looking at are very much wedded to this tradition of print, paper types of publication. Traditionally, when we think about zine history or zine culture, it's been very much fixed within science fiction, punk, and riot girl subcultures. And while I'm definitely saying that the Latino zine makers I'm looking at are in conversation with that, I also want to trouble it a little bit and really think about alternative paper routes, if you will, for that history. And for me, that really begins in 60s, 70s, and 80s politicized alternative Latino print culture. And so I'm looking at zine makers from Chicago and the way that they are in conversation with both of these genealogical histories in order to produce their zines. So it's really about the inscription, the production, the circulation of Latino identities in the Midwest through zines. And I do that by specifically looking at the work of Oscar Ariola and Chema Scandal. Together they formed the first Logan Square Zine Festival entitled Zine Mercado. And so I look at the images that they incorporate into that that are very much telling you a history not only of Chicago, but of Latino Chicago, as well as promotional material and the creation or the curation of a zine compilation that includes images from various zine vendors that are brought together in this book-like form. And so I'm really thinking about placemaking not only as tied to a particular geographic location like Logan Square, but also the way it's manifested and circulated within this, within print culture in the form of the zine.
This is really wonderful, and one of the things that I've really enjoyed about being in conversation with each other and the larger group over the past year is that the kinds of questions that one project asks all of a sudden becomes of great significance for the others. So in listening to Ariana talk about these alternative modes of circulation of print culture and so on, I start thinking about both Sergio and Emiliano's projects, and I'm quite curious to hear a little bit more about what forms of print culture similarly aided the particular activist projects that you document.
Well, Ramon, I'm glad you point that out because the sanctuary movement had two principal objectives. One was humanitarian concern to offer some sort of support for these individuals who arrived in the United States, but the second one was just as important. It was a political one to really change the situation in Washington, D.C., but across the country that would not allow for Central Americans to achieve actual refugee status. Now, in order to spread this message across the United States, you needed to disseminate that information in some way. And the Chicago Religious Task Force on Central America was central in making this connection kind of felt across the country. They produced a number of printed materials to help congregations as far as Seattle to Florida make the decision on whether or not they would become sanctuary congregations, a process that is known as a discernment process. So they created what are known as how-to manuals, how to have these conversations on whether or not a congregation was prepared to enter into the sanctuary movement. They had a newsletter that was called Basta. And that newsletter did a number of things. It shared information about the continuing revolutions in Central America. It showed the United States complicity in really reinforcing the situation through military aid and making it more difficult for Central American nations to really self-determine their own path. And it also shared information about what was happening in congregations in Milwaukee and Chicago, Tucson and Los Angeles. So it really made this interconnected network that stretched across the United States and eventually transnationally to Central America as well.
Emiliano, how about your project?
Well, within my work, I've been extremely fortunate to have the Latin Times, a bilingual newspaper within the region. Perusing through minutes, ordinances of the City Council in East Chicago, I see these resolutions that are put forth by the Concerned Latins organization. However, these are not available in the city clerk's office. Luckily, the Concerned Latins utilize the Spanish and English language newspaper to reprint these in their entirety. And this is pretty common within the duration of the Latin Times of reproducing and sort of cultivating its own history of recording these events and these social ills that this organization was putting forth. So I heavily utilize that newspaper in my own research.
It's wonderful to, again, to think about these projects together, but also to think about them in relation to the effort that we're undertaking collectively to similarly produce scholarship in print media and other forms like this program that is intent in similarly documenting and advancing more knowledge about Latinx communities here in the Midwest. And I would really want to thank you for each of your individual contributions and for being part of this continued conversation. I now want to invite my co-principal investigators to join me on the stage. Thank you so much. Because one of the things that is important to note here, please come in, Claire, Teresa, and Jerry. So one of the things that's exciting about this project is that it builds on an earlier effort, as Teresa mentioned at the beginning of our time today, which is the Latino Midwest Reader, which Claire has on her lap right now, and we can show for you. This is a project that was similarly finished here at Iowa City at the Obermann Center for the Humanities, Obermann Center for Advanced Studies, here at the University of Iowa. So we feel like we're going second time round robin into the process of thinking together for a long period of time about the work of and the lives of Latinos in the Midwest, and doing the work of scholarship to document, understand, theorize, and advance knowledge about these communities and their long history and significant contributions to this region. And because of that, I wanted to close our time here together reflecting a little bit on this kind of long-term project, the kinds of relationships we've been sustaining over this period, and what we imagine are the enduring contributions of what we're doing here. So Teresa, I wanted, as our project leader this time around, I wanted to give you the floor and hear what you see as key directions for the project and what you see this joint research venture advancing for the greater good.
Thank you. I really agree with you that this has been the second iteration. That sense of continuity with the first project has really been here, even though it isn't the same group of people. Some of us participated in the first project. Others of us, we hope, will participate in a third project. So that's one of the key things that come out of this, is that we always saw ourselves as building upon the first collaboration and really working to sustain the development of concentrated research and attention to Latinas and Latinos in the Midwest region through scholarship, through mentorship, and through graduate student education. And those parts of how we've led the project, I think, have been really rewarding and enriching. And I think that all of us agree, especially after this week of sharing our chapters and really engaging deeply with each other's ideas and archives and conceptions about this particular topic of placemaking, that there is so much more research to be done. And we really want to encourage everyone who's watching, if this is a topic that you're interested in, to take a Latino Studies class in your area. At all of our universities, we offer Latino Studies classes, and you too can make a huge difference in contributing to our knowledge about our peoples in this region. So I think that's really important.
And I think you heard it here first, folks, that there's going to be a third project. So stay tuned. First, we have to finish the second one, but there will be a third project. Really, the two things that have stuck out for me are just the collaboration itself and how through the process of talking about our own respective projects and what links them, how in our own small way we have also done the work and our share of creating the Latino Midwest through the creation of an intellectual Latino community, or an intellectual community of scholars working on the Latinx Midwest. And the other thing is just the sheer range of projects we're working on across the region, both in terms of the geography and the kinds of projects, so on political activism, festivals, literature, performance, all kinds of things, really just shows how deeply rooted Latinos are in the community and have been here for a long time and aren't going anywhere.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Ramon and Teresa, for mentioning the first iteration of the Latino Midwest Project. You know, that was really transformative for the University of Iowa, because UI was the remaining Big Ten institution to establish Latino studies as an academic discipline. And following that series of linked events, we were able to get Latino studies off the ground here. So UI students, you most of all need to register for your Latino studies courses. But the other significant outcome of that project too was the publication of the Latino Midwest Reader through University of Illinois Press. And when we sat down as a group of scholars to work on that project, you know, we were really often working on specific topics that had not been addressed in scholarly venues before. And in the past 5 to 10 years, I would say this field is really booming, or at least blossoming, in the sense of there's a lot of interest and a lot of momentum around it. And this project in this past week has really led me to think deeply about questions concerning placemaking and diverse strategies of placemaking in ways that I think I'm really going to be continuing to process as we bring this next book to publication. When I came to the Midwest, my previous position was in California, and my training was in US-Mexico border studies. So I turned to the Latino Midwest as a way to make NAFTA-era policy relevant for my students here. And what I found was that small towns like my case study town of Hampton are also very strongly implicated in the changes that NAFTA brought about. In fact, many of the Latinx people from Veracruz, for example, in Hampton, migrated to the United States as a result of the suffering of farm and family farm structure in their home state. So I had a kind of new perspective through looking at small communities in the Midwest in relationship to my previous formation. And one thing that this current conversation with you all has led me to consider more thoroughly is what we mean when we say Rust Belt.
Right, yes.
The Midwest is often described as a Rust Belt or as deindustrialized, but I think that the story is in fact more complicated. The sites of industrialization have changed, and in some cases the industries have changed, but small communities throughout the Midwest are seeing new protagonists of industrialization, especially in Latinx laborers and people who are making homes in Midwestern communities.
Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you so much, everyone. And to you, our viewers at PATV, for joining us to learn more about the Latino, Latina, Latinx Midwest. We hope that you've enjoyed learning about all of these different platforms by artists, by activists, by alternative press venues to document and think about the role of Latinos in this region. And that if you want to learn more, that you pursue additional content available here at PATV, including the program that we filmed yesterday with Professor Larry LaFontaine Stokes about the important work of Fausto Fernos at Studio 13 here in downtown Iowa, and that you look forward to the publication of the volume that we're working on together and other media materials that we hope to produce alongside. So thank you for joining us. Thank you to our friends here at PATV. Thank you to the University of Iowa for hosting us, especially Professor Claire Fox, and to you, our viewer, for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.